What's going on, everyone? Welcome back to another episode of the Muscle Memoirs Podcast. Today, it is my pleasure to be joined by Dr. Kimber Stanhope. Dr. Stanhope, how are you doing today?
Fine, thank you. It's a pleasure to be here, Mike.
I'm really excited to get into our topic of discussion for today. But before Dr. Stanhope, for our listeners who might not already be familiar with you, can you provide us a background about yourself and your current research focus?
I certainly can, Mike. It was clear back in 1998 that we sort of accidentally started on this road of investigating the metabolic effects of sugar. We were doing what's often done in research labs, investigating a completely different question. And in doing so, we came up with data that said, oh my gosh, we need to look at this more closely. And what we found was the sugar fructose causes very different and far more negative effects on health than the sugar glucose. And we got a hint of that data in 99. We pursued it and got more data in 2000. We wrote an NIH grant that took 3 years to get funded, but finally got funded. And so it was basically around 2006 or 7. I had just gotten preliminary data back from our trial. And again, this trial was very specific to the effects of fructose versus the effects of glucose. And I remember pulling up that early data. It was from our collaborators in Japan who could do some of the lipid measurements that we couldn't do at the time. They're easy to do now, but at this point it was like small dense LDL cholesterol and so forth. That wasn't available everywhere back then. So pulled up this data and was looking at their lipid outcomes. All of these lipid outcomes were related to cardiovascular disease risk. Saw how clean and consistent the data was, how negative the effects of fructose were compared to glucose. And I said to myself, oh darn, I'm going to be studying fructose in humans for the rest of my career. And I wasn't happy about the thought because back then I was doing lots and lots of animal studies, rat studies, but also in vitro cultured, isolated adipocyte studies. And compared to a human study, these studies are very quick and easy, which obviously mainly because when you deal with rats and you deal with cultured fat cells, you have a lot more control over their behavior than you do humans. So I was not excited to spend the rest of my life as a clinical researcher, but that grant, that data led to very important publications and have led to 4 more NIH grants, that have kept us on this trail studying the effects of sugar consumption in humans. And so that's my career. Accidentally ended up on sugar and the data left us there. There was no choice. And my model is the human subject because that's the most relevant to our epidemics of metabolic disease.
Humans certainly are a tricky and difficult species to work with, but whether or not it was an accident, I think everyone in the nutrition community is particularly thankful for the road you eventually ended up traveling, Dr. Stanhope.
Thank you. It's that's nice to hear. Sometimes it feels sometimes a lot of good things happen. Interesting things happen, funny things happen, but at the same time, when you're doing very expensive human trials, it's a struggle because these trials are so expensive, and it is so easy for reviewers to, well, here is the absolute truth. When we were trying in the early 2000s to get our first NIH grant to look at our preliminary, study fructose versus glucose even more because our preliminary data was so interesting, we got responses back from reviewers saying, oh, it's clear that sugar is not a problem for heart disease. That's been studied a long time ago in the 70s. John Yudkin said sugar was bad. We proved it wasn't. Who needs to go there? It only was 10 years later that reviewers were saying, everybody knows sugar is bad for you. Why do we need to keep studying this? People aren't going to eat less sugar anyway. And it's a very frustrating, catch-22, getting the money to prove something that people are skeptical about. Then as soon as you approve it, studying it even more to get to really important questions is just as hard. And a perfect example of a really important question that has not been studied adequately in the least is the effects of sugar in sugar-sweetened beverage versus the effects of sugar in cookies, cakes, donuts, chocolate. We don't know that answer. And it's a real deterrent when it comes to establishing public health policy. We have been contacted. I'm part of a University of California beverage consortium, and our goal is to provide the expertise to health advocates and even state legislators that help them establish evidence-based health policies. And we've been asked over and over again, well, it looks like a sugar-sweetened beverage tax could be a good idea in decreasing sugar-sweetened beverage, and it could also be a great way to generate funds for more education, more fitness programs, especially for children. But how do I address the argument from the beverage industry that they're being targeted, and why aren't we also going to tax the cookies and the candy and the donuts? And so can you provide the evidence that shows sugar-sweetened beverage is worse? And the answer is no, the study hasn't been done. And I have tried 4 times to get funding for that study. And I don't think the answer is no because I'm a lousy grant writer, but I think the answer is no just because it's such a lottery when you send that grant in. You have to get 3 reviewers who are, one, open to the possibility that a beverage tax could be a good thing to our public health crises. 2, they have to be willing to believe we don't, that this data is instrumental and is going to be instrumental in giving us the answer that, one, gosh, we need to tax both sugar-sweetened beverages and candy, or it's rational to go after just the sugar-sweetened beverage. The data supports that. And I just haven't hit those 3 magic reviewers that I'm able to convince that this is important. And it's very frustrating. And I'll probably end up, kind of out of the world of research before I get that study funded. Maybe we're definitely going to try again, after the COVID crisis is over, but I'm not confident, and you never can be confident when you write an NIH grant. Your chances are 10% anyway, and, whether I'll ever get this one passed, that, make that 10% cutoff is very questionable.
A lot of thoughts are coming to mind after listening to that, and that is, as our topic of discussion today, which is added sugar consumption, I think it's a lot more nuanced than many people make it out to be. I mean, you just mentioned here whether, the data would be equivalent when we're looking at added sugar in a cookie compared to a sugar-sweetened beverage. And most listeners would be like, what point are we trying to make here? Both are terrible for health, right? But it's a little more nuanced than that, because you mentioned we don't actually have direct trials to show that. And when we consider the effect of the food matrix, which is an interesting phenomenon, it may very well be the case that when you combine these added sugars with, other fats and certain things and put it into a food matrix as opposed to just in a liquid form in a beverage, there can be differential effects. And if we look at this tax on sugar-sweetened beverages in Philadelphia, I consider the soda tax that was relevant for where I went to university. I always wondered about the approach behind this, because I think the data is there to support it, but then I look at things and I see, well, there's this tax on Coke, but then you can go grab a Gatorade or this, fruit juice with added sugars. And to me, we're more or less looking at the same product, but someone will just go, well, why would I pay for the extra cost for the Coke if I can just go grab a Gatorade with similar calories and added sugar in it and get the same effect? So to me, I think it's relevant to have the tax, but it almost seems misguided in that sense. But maybe I'm mistaken by that. What are your thoughts there?
It is a very controversial subject, and there are researchers out there whose work I admire and agree with 100%, who think it's too myopic to be looking just at added sugar, that there's this whole hyper palatable food environment that includes things like potato chips and fried chicken nuggets. All of it is part of the disaster that we have with regard to public health. And that instead of saying don't eat sugar, it needs to be beans, fresh vegetable, fresh fruit, whole grain. If you're eating meat, low fat, minimal servings, the whole thing, going for the least refined diet possible. And I agree with that too. To me, the idea of saying, let nature be your food processor, not big industry, makes a lot of sense and is a probably more encompassing and healthful approach than saying eliminate the added sugar. But at the same time, if we can't get people to, the competition for the food dollar it's being won by the food processors. Easy, easy, easy. So it's a huge, huge change. And it's a huge economical change that we'd be fought against, tooth and nail. So I guess if you think, well, starting with sugar-sweetened beverage is one good step we can make, it's justified. But the idea that somebody who eats out, 5-6 times a week, fast food, and many, many people do. I mean, that is very close to the average, at least for adolescents. And whose house is full of, sugar frosted cereals and potato chips and other highly refined foods. They can get rid of the added sugar, and it might not even show up in a health profile. I don't know. We do know, though, that there are 4 studies out there now that have been specific to restriction of sugar. And all 4 of them showed very impressive effects on liver fat. Fatty liver disease is, one of our new epidemics. And I think it's a new epidemic very, very related to added sugar consumption, and especially sugar sweetened beverage consumption. These 4 studies and how quickly they showed positive effects on liver fat are very promising, and they do support the idea that we could possibly make some inroads on our epidemics just by focusing on added sugar.
With that being said, let's get into the weeds here, Dr. Stanhope.
Sure.
And I think probably the question I'm most interested in getting closer to the truth on is the impact of added sugar on physical markers of health independent of an energy surplus. So I think there are many quote-unquote evidence-based practitioners in this field who would put forth that, well, sugar as itself is not inherently negative. The negative effects of sugar are due to the fact that it is highly palatable. You can easily find yourself in an energy surplus and accumulating excess body weight from incorporating a lot of sugar in your diet. And then they would also put forth that if you're in an energy deficit or if you're maintaining a healthy body weight, that consuming a moderate amount of sugar in the diet has no detrimental effects. But it might be a little more complicated than that, and I hope you can shed some light on that truth.
Sure. Those two study subjects I mentioned that we couldn't study last March because COVID shut down our study, they were the last 2 subjects for a study in which we have 20 subjects who consumed high fructose corn syrup sweetened beverages with controlled diets. And we provided the diets: breakfast, lunch, dinner, snacks, beverage. Not fun. It was a very hard study, and we really wanted to get it done. But we now have 20 subjects who have consumed high fructose corn syrup sweetened beverage without gaining weight. For the 20 subjects, the weight gain graph looks like that. That's all I know about the data so far, because we haven't even started sorting into groups and looking at the actual risk factors. I just know about the body weight. That study will probably provide the strongest evidence, yes or no. If we still see changes in risk factors, and again, we tried to hit all the important risk factors. So we actually measure de novo lipogenesis. That's where the liver turns the extra sugar into fat. We are measuring the levels of liver fat. We're measuring liver insulin resistance plus whole body insulin resistance, and then plus all the standard circulating risk factors like LDL cholesterol, uric acid, and so forth. It was a heartbreaker not to finish those 2 subjects and have that study done. So I'd be able to provide a lot more definitive data. And it could turn out that those people who tell you it's all about the calories are correct. I don't think they're correct for 3 different reasons. Okay. Reason 1 is my previous study, which I call our dose response study. We actually had subjects who consumed 0 or 10%, 17.5%, or 25% of their energy requirement as high fructose corn syrup for only 2 weeks. During the course of this study, they spent 12 days consuming these beverages with their ad lib usual diets, meaning they could eat as much or as little as they wanted. And sure enough, just like the people you just referred to would suspect, we saw a dose response effect on body weight. The more sugar they consumed, the more they gained weight. However, it's also important to point out that the 10% group did not gain body weight. Their change in body weight was 0.05 kilograms, and our scales aren't even that accurate to the 0.05. They're accurate to a tenth. They're not accurate to a hundredth. So basically, we call that group, they didn't change body weight. However, the dose response effect on all the risk factors that we looked at, and the ones we have published are all the lipid and uric acid risk factors, beautiful stair step. With each increasing dose, we saw an increase in those risk factors. But what totally surprised me about this study, we even saw significant increases in risk factors in the 10% group. That's the group that didn't gain body weight. It's also that 10% of calories that we provided them as a high fructose corn syrup sweetened beverage was basically equivalent to giving them a half a 12-ounce can of soda at breakfast, at lunch, and at dinner. So if you had asked me going into this study, did I think a half a can at breakfast, lunch, and dinner would increase risk factors significantly in only 2 weeks? I would have told you no. I didn't think so. So basically, this study showed, wow, our bodies really are sensitive to the amount of sugar we consume. And it also suggested in that 10% group, at least, you didn't need to see a weight gain to do that. Now, other studies, there is a research group from the 70s, early 80s, who have published some amazing studies. I say they're amazing from the point of view that how hard they were to do. They did crossover studies, which means the subjects kept coming back. They would participate for 6 weeks at a time, have a washout period, then another 6 weeks, and have a washout period, then another 6 weeks. Well, for this study, the subjects were on a low sucrose diet in which only 5% of their calories were from sucrose. How did they know? They provided breakfast, lunch, dinner, snacks. So 5%, 18%, and 33% of the 3 diets were from sugar. So they did them crossover style, random. So they did low, medium, or high, high, low, medium, but whatever, everybody participated in all 3 arms. That meant 18 weeks of consuming controlled diets. Like I said, I'm doing it right now for 12 weeks, and it's really hard. Very, very hard. And to keep subjects willing to eat repetitive diets that you make. Maybe it was easier back then, but I'm my subjects tend to be college students, and they're all really excited at the prospect of free food at the beginning of the study. And it only takes a couple weeks into it when I want to go have pizza and beer with my friends. It's hard. So anyway, these guys did these very remarkable studies, and their studies were set up just like mine is to not allow anybody to gain weight. If anybody showed any sign of gaining weight, they scaled back the calories to get them at a plateau. And these studies from a long time ago showed very definite increases in risk factors in the group that consumed 18% and 33%. So those studies also convince me you don't have to gain weight to see that sugar has direct effects that are not mediated by weight gain. More recently, my collaborator down at Touro University, Dr. John Mark Schwartz, has done a very short study. It's only 8 days. And in his study, the subjects either consumed fructose sweetened beverage with one diet or the same diet in which there was no beverage. Instead, they consumed complex carbohydrate. And in only 8 days, this was also crossover. When the subjects were on fructose, they saw higher de novo lipogenesis, higher liver fat, less fat oxidation or fat burning, and then, higher levels of triglycerides circulating in the blood. So that is the third study that I know of for sure where we've seen people consume diets that do not allow weight gain, but we still see negative effects of sugar.
I think a lot of people like to play armchair researcher and criticize certain studies for whatever limitations they may have, but not really understand the process of conducting research. And one of the common things you'll hear is that, well, this study was only for, X number of days or a couple of weeks, and that short duration is a limitation. But in this scenario, if we're seeing significant physical changes from 7 days, I mean, that's remarkable. I mean, that should be concerning when we are most concerned about these long-term effects and how that could compound over time if we're seeing these changes in only a week.
Right. The limitations of diet intervention studies are very important, but it's also why you don't just look at the diet intervention studies, but you also look at the population studies. Plus, you look at the mechanistic studies that we can only do in animal models, not humans. And you put those together, and that's called the totality of the evidence. So the most persuasive of the studies with regard to the role of sugar and cardiovascular disease relates to death. This isn't even just a study about whether you have risk for cardiovascular disease or whether you actually have it. It's about whether you died from it. And over a 15-year period, this group and the researchers that did this study are probably the most expert epidemiologists in the world. They're at Harvard, led by Dr. Frank Hugh. They reported compared to the group that consumed less than 10% of their energy as added sugar. Now, this is added sugar. This isn't just sugar-sweetened beverage. It's the whole thing. With each increasing level, the risk of death by cardiovascular disease over a 15-year period was significantly higher. And it was double if you consumed more than 20% of your energy as added sugar. But it was an increase of 18% if you consumed what is the average amount of added sugar consumption in this country. So the average person in this country is consuming enough sugar to increase their risk of death via cardiovascular disease over a 15-year period by 18%. Who wants to do that? But that's what the average person is doing. But that's an epidemiology study, purely only shows association. But you put it together with my study where we saw dose response effects on risk factors for cardiovascular disease. That means something. When you put them together, it means something really important. And one of the things that people like to criticize about dietary intervention studies is they only measure risk factors. They don't actually measure people who get the disease. And you just shake your head. Of course we don't. We're not allowed to. If I write a study saying I'm going to give people sugar until they develop cardiovascular disease, it's not going to get funded or approved. And anybody who volunteers to be in a study like that is not doing a smart thing. So it is amazing how many people I have seen. I've actually seen it in writing in review articles, actually saying to limit, the dietary intervention studies are inadequate in that they only measure risk factors and actually do not show progression of the disease to disease. And it's like, fine, you devote your life trying to get a study like that funded.
I love it. I love it.
Yeah.
Dr. Stanhope, you've outlined multiple lines of evidence here. I think perhaps now might be a good time then to get into some more mechanistic reasons for why glucose and fructose in particular may possess some unique cardiometabolic consequences. So with that being said, could you outline for the listeners some of the differences in metabolism and hepatic uptake of glucose versus fructose?
I love this question. And the reason I love this question is because there's such a clear answer. And hopefully I do, and I am going to explain it in a way that the listeners will actually remember and say, oh, that's why sugar is worse than white bread. Okay? So yes, the reason there is such an impact of added sugar on our health is that one of its components is fructose. The other component is glucose. So we early in the game started studying fructose versus glucose, which is kind of a dumb study in a way because none of our sweetened beverages contain pure fructose or pure glucose. So that's one of the things that, limitations of our early work. Well, so what? Nobody consumes these beverages, pure fructose or pure glucose alone. But these studies were absolutely essential for leading to the mechanistic difference that helps us understand why a fructose-containing sugar is a problem for our health. And it comes down to this. Both sugars end up in the intestine, and they leave the intestine via the portal vein. The first stop for the portal vein after the blood leaves the intestine is the liver. And this gives the liver the first rights to all the sugar we consume. And the liver can make two decisions. It can say, nah, don't want it, and let the sugar bypass the liver and go to the muscle, the brain, the fat cells, the nerve cells. Or the muscle can say, oh, pull in that sugar. We'll use it. All right. Now, the decision of whether the sugar stays in the liver or heads to the rest of the body is made by what we call the rate limiting enzyme. But they're different for glucose and fructose. The rate limiting enzyme for glucose is regulated by hepatic energy status. That means that's the scientific way of saying it's regulated by whether the energy is needed by the liver. When the liver needs energy, that enzyme is turned on and the glucose gets pulled into the liver. Whatever the liver doesn't need sails away to the rest of the body. In the case of fructose, it's different enzyme. This enzyme is not regulated by hepatic energy status. That means whether the liver needs energy or whether it doesn't need energy, that enzyme is turned on, such that pretty much all the fructose in the big, huge 32-ounce drink is going to end up in the liver. And when I say nearly all, the latest evidence suggests 85% of it is going to end up in the liver. So let's say only 15% ends up in the blood. Well, the liver does the best it can with that great big overload of fructose. It turns some of it into glucose and stores it as glycogen. It turns some of it into lactate acid, and it certainly uses some of it as energy. But it still has to do something with the leftover. And the liver does with the leftover what our body does with extra substrate. It turns it into fat. Okay. So that's why sugar consumption leads to increased levels of liver fat in the liver. That made sense. Liver fat in the liver. So anyway, with increased liver fat, what you get then is more fat being sent out into the blood, both as triglyceride, but also cholesterol, because every particle of triglyceride that gets sent out, the liver also packages some cholesterol in that too. So immediately within 1 day of consuming high amounts of fructose or high fructose corn syrup or sucrose, triglyceride levels go up such that by 10 o'clock at night, they're much higher than they were the night before when you didn't consume your big dose of sugar. Cholesterol doesn't stay up immediately. It takes more like a week of constant exposure to the sugar-sweetened beverage for cholesterol levels to start staying up. But there's another bad thing about that extra liver fat in the liver. All of it doesn't end up in the blood. Some of it's still in the liver. And liver fat is strongly associated with insulin resistance. Insulin resistance means your insulin is not doing a good job of all the jobs it's required to do. And there are so many. People think of insulin as being only the hormone that's important for opening the doors of the cell and letting the sugar get into cells, but it has many more jobs than that. Insulin is all about regulating lipids too. So when insulin's not doing its job in the liver, you get even more fat making in the liver. It revs up de novo lipogenesis. You get even more fat being sent out into the blood. And what we really have here is this vicious cycle that's perpetuated by our sugar, such that the sugar started DNL going up, de novo lipogenesis, the fat making went up. That increased liver fat. Liver fat impaired insulin's ability to do its job. That makes DNL go up even more. That sends out even more triglyceride into the blood. And then if you continue to feed the cycle, this little vicious cycle with sugar, it's just going to rev even more. And that is why sugar is so damaging to our health.
I think that was an absolutely excellent overview, and I really appreciate that. You noted there some perhaps particular consequences of excess fructose consumption, and I think for many of the listeners that might steer their mind toward, well, what about fruit? Isn't fruit rich in fructose? So based on the current evidence, Dr. Stanhope, do we have reason to believe that excessive fructose consumption solely from whole fruits may possess some deleterious consequences to our health, or is this mostly in the context of these sugar-sweetened beverages?
It's mostly in the context of sugar-sweetened beverages, and also it could be a solid food. The old studies I talked to you about that were done in the 70s and 80s, they provided the sucrose in a kind of wafer, a patty, a solid food patty that had a lot of fat in it to hold it together. So it was, probably kind of like eating a cookie. But basically in the concept, to me, the most important difference between fruit and a sugar-sweetened beverage is all the other things that are in the fruit, including the fiber. The fiber is going to slow the delivery of the fruit sugar to the liver. So instead of getting this great big overload all at the same time, which leaves a lot of leftover showing up immediately that gets turned into fat, the fruit sugar is going to be delivered over a greater period of time. Therefore, less of it will get turned into fat. Also, that fruit has thousands of bioactives that haven't even been studied to know whether any of them affect liver processes. Do any of them make insulin more sensitive? Do any of them block de novo lipogenesis? There's all sorts of things these bioactives could be doing to help protect against the negative effects I just described. But here is a third reason that we as a nation don't have to be that worried about fruit. It is so much easier to consume 500 calories worth of a sugar-sweetened beverage than 500 calories of fruit. And we actually tested that concept in our lab. This wasn't a research study, but everybody in my lab took home 25% of their energy requirement as whole fruit. And it was in apples, oranges, pear, peach, and grapes, I think, were the 5 different fruits that the research subject, not my staff, took home. 7 of them took it home. 3 of them ate it all and reported that they would never do it again. That was way more fruit than they could eat, and it hurt. The other 4 couldn't even eat it all. But I have given 25% of energy as a sugar-sweetened beverage to research subjects, some of them for 12 weeks, some of them for 4 weeks, some of them for 2 weeks, some of them, nobody has ever complained that they couldn't drink it all. Nobody. It is just amazing how much easier it is for people to consume that many calories worth of fruit, that many calories worth of sugar sweetened beverage than it is for them to consume that many calories as fruit. And so that's why I'm saying pretty safe that it's not fruit that's causing our public health epidemics. And chances are that if we all made an effort to replace the sugar sweetened beverage that we consume with fruit, we'd be healthier. However, I've never yet seen a study where I thought the two were compared adequately. It's another one of those NIH grants that I've written and did not get funded.
Well, thank you for that clarification. We're in some weird times these days. I mean, we have access to more information than ever, yet it seems the public is more confused than ever when it comes to nutrition. And, I think many would agree that fruit is not, the driver of the current obesity epidemic, but there are a number of practitioners in this field that are continuing to demonize fruit. So I thought it was worth mentioning, and I really appreciate your insight. I think this all builds up really nicely into some very recent work of yours, and that is the potentially synergistic effect of glucose with fructose in the form of high fructose corn syrup. Can you elaborate on these findings, considering we've just outlined here how fructose might be particularly detrimental and glucose, relatively benign in comparison, but when you combine these, there might be the most powerful detrimental effect on our health?
Yes, that was another one of those research surprises that I was not expecting, because I was actually feeling pretty good about demonizing fructose and considering glucose a benign component of our diet. Not that we really consume glucose sweetened beverages, but I don't know if anybody had ever decided, based on our early data, to start marketing glucose sweetened beverages. I probably would have thought, well, okay, that's a good idea. So I'm glad I know what I do now. But this was based on a study where we didn't just look at subjects consuming fructose and glucose, but we also had subjects consuming high fructose corn syrup. And we also had them consuming fructose or high fructose corn syrup at 2 different doses. The high dose at 25% and then the medium dose at 17.5%. And the results were surprising. Now, for some of those risk factors that I talked about, saying that fructose increases the amount of triglyceride that gets into your blood right away, that was one of the risk factors that was exactly what we expected. The more fructose you consumed, that risk factor was highest. But there's 3 other risk factors. Let's talk about 2 of them. One's called LDL cholesterol, and everybody's heard of that because I think almost everybody knows this is the risk factor that is most related to risk of cardiovascular disease. That might not be 100% true, but for the perspective, a lot of people still believe it. So it's very important to be looking at LDL cholesterol. And then another one is apolipoprotein B. That's the favorite risk factor for many, many scientists. They think that's a more important risk factor than LDL. Both of these, much to our surprise, were higher in the subjects consuming high fructose corn syrup than, now it wasn't significant. It was just basically the graph looked like this, where high fructose corn syrup, 25%. I'm sorry, high fructose corn syrup, 25%, fructose, 25%, then glucose way down here. Then we had 17% high fructose corn syrup, 17% fructose. It was a very strong trend, such it was significantly different. And it surprised us. Why is this happening? Because basically our impression was the more fructose, the worse the health effect. And here is high fructose corn syrup showing a potentially worse effect than fructose. So we were able then to do the statistical analysis where we were able to ask the program, well, tell us then if this effect is due to the presence of glucose. Is glucose doing something together with the fructose that is having an effect specifically on the LDL and the ApoB that makes it worse? And the answer was yes. So synergy, the other word when you're doing statistical analyses, is interacting. The fructose and the glucose were doing an interaction together that made the outcome worse than what we would have predicted based on what we knew about the mechanisms of fructose and the mechanisms of glucose. So we had to come up with just an idea of what might be going on. This idea is completely untested because these data are new. It just got published last summer. But our suggestion is, yes, because there's fructose in high fructose corn syrup, we see more of those particles made by the liver that contain cholesterol and triglyceride. Okay? They're going out into the blood. But somewhere along the line, the high glucose level is causing the cholesterol specifically in that particle to hang around. And therefore, it could be because it's oxidizing the cholesterol. It could be just because it's glycating. Glycating means glucose interacts with a component of another cell and causes it to be glycated. And that oxidative process or that glycation process is preventing the particle from being picked up by a cell, whether it be a muscle cell, a liver cell, something that could use the product, and it's just leaving it hanging around in the blood. And that's a risk factor because the longer particles like LDL cholesterol hang around in the blood, the more likely they're going to end up in an endothelial cell. Those are the cells that line our blood vessel, and those are the cells that eventually could turn into atherosclerotic cells. So that's just a suggestion that the glucose is causing retention of these LDL cholesterol cells. Don't know if that's going to turn out to be true. It has to be tested.
Those are some absolutely fascinating results. Overall, this was an extremely comprehensive discussion on sugar. I thoroughly enjoyed it. I know the listeners are going to get a ton out of this one, but I got one more question for you, Dr. Stanhope. I'm compiling this informal meta-analysis of sorts. Whenever I have a prolific nutrition researcher on like yourself, I have to ask the question, whatever immediately comes to your mind, when it comes to these rising rates of obesity and cardiometabolic disease, where have we gone wrong in our continuous quest to attenuate this issue? Why aren't things getting better? Should we be shifting our research focus? If so, where?
I think where we went wrong is allowing the industry to turn our food environment into one of refined. They're not artificial foods because, the carbohydrate did come from a wheat grain or a rice grain, but stripping out anything of nutritive value, stripping out all fiber, putting it together with fat, often saturated fat, putting it together with salt, putting it together with sugar until we hit that bliss point, which I'm sure your readers have known about it. And then having something that is so hyper palatable that especially children, our adolescents, they prefer to eat that food over the broccoli. Big surprise, right? And unfortunately, I do believe these foods, maybe they're not addictive like a drug, but they do perpetuate, I believe, reward centers in the brain that make us crave them more. You stop eating these foods, you're not going to go into the same type of withdrawal as you would withdrawing from cocaine. But even so, in a way, getting off this hyper palatable, easy to consume, ever available food for many people is just as hard as stopping the smoking. And that's where we have completely gone wrong. And one thing that possibly is an important new piece of data is functional MRI is a relatively new procedure that allows us to actually look at blood flow to certain parts of the brain and knowing they're reacting stronger than other parts of the brain. And so this has allowed us to learn about certain things about eating in terms of reactions in the reward centers. And one of the things that seems most important to me is over time, with continued consumption of, let's say, a palatable food, what is going up is the reward reaction to images of that palatable food, that anticipating the eating of that powerful food increases over time. And the response that the researchers see in reward centers when they show pictures of palatable foods to people actually predicts how much weight they're going to gain over the next 15 years or so. Well, that's scary because our environment is full of images and actual sites of hyper palatable foods. So it's full of advertisements for hyper palatable foods. if our brains are reacting super strongly to those images and those reactions then lead to actual consumption of those foods, no wonder we have an obesity epidemic, because everybody looking at the availability of sugar and the availability of junk food, but also how much more advertising for hyper-palatable foods do we have now than we did 50 years ago when everybody was normal weight? Huge amounts. So that, in my mind, is something that maybe researchers need to start focusing on more. And I think we need to be doing studies, if it's possible to even do such studies, if we eliminate the advertising, if we get rid of the billboards, if we get rid of the product placement, is it possible we would actually see a reduction in obesity prevalence? I would love to know the answer to that. We might get to find out because, well, Chile, the country Chile, has enacted, and it went full force in 2019, so way too recently to know the results, really strict laws about targeted marketing of unhealthy foods to children. So it'll be fascinating to see over time whether they can affect the childhood obesity prevalence in this country. They're the first country to enact super strong regulations. And that includes cartoon characters and celebrity endorsements and all the things that are so commonly accepted here as, sure, you know, there has been, you know, statements made by powerful food companies. Yes, targeted marketing to children is not a good thing, but in our country, those statements have not led to targeted marketing to children going down in the least. In fact, it's even going up because now with Facebook, YouTube influencers, and all the other games, you know, all those influences, you have actually doubled the exposure that children get to marketing of unhealthy foods.
Those are such great points, Dr. Stanhope. I couldn't agree more. I appreciate you sharing your insight into the topic. It's something we definitely need to learn more about and really tease out the details, because at the current rates, at the projections for the next couple of decades, things are not trending in the right direction.
Not at all.
For our listeners who want to go support you, learn more about you, where can we point them toward? Are you on social media, maybe ResearchGate?
No, tell you the truth, I don't even have a personal email because I can hardly keep up with my university email. So no, I have not, but please, I do have many recent studies coming out. So just keeping, you know, do a Google search with my name and checking out, you know, do a advanced search for the last 30 days and check out my new studies, because I'm very excited to get these studies out. I think they're some of the most important work we've done over the last 20 years. And the best way to follow me is an advanced Google search where you go for the last 30 days.
Excellent. I'm looking forward to following along with those results, and links to all of the relevant research we discussed in our conversation today will be in the show notes. But that does it for another episode of the Muscle Memoirs Podcast. Thank you so much for listening, everyone.
Thank you much, Mike.
Hey guys, Mike here. If you're interested in learning more about how to maximize your health, body composition, and performance, head over to hammerawayfitness.com where you can sign up for coaching or even just schedule an hour consult with me to get some of your training and nutrition questions answered. Also, if you enjoyed this episode as much as I did and would like to further support the growth of the Muscle Memoirs podcast, you can give a donation to the link in the show notes, leave us a review, and or share this episode with your friends, whether that be dropping the link in a group chat or putting a screenshot in your Instagram story. I truly appreciate it.